Hi guys, my wonderful philosophy students. Thank you for tuning in for this exciting episode of the introduction to the Tao Te Ching. That wonderful book that you have in your possession by now, hopefully, and that 2,500-year-old book. It's a very old book. So again, this talking to a camera rather than people is a new experience for me. So I'm going to do my best to present this information in a way that is makes sense, hopefully, in a sort of chronological or logical way. I'm going to try to do this in one shot, so I don't have to spend a bunch of time editing. So if there's goofy parts or parts where I lose my train of thought or whatever, well, it'll remain to be seen if I decide to edit it or not. You'll find out. Okay. So anyway, thank you guys for being here and the grace that you'll give me in discussing this book with you in this format. Okay, so let's get to the book. Here are all of my copies of the Tao Te Ching. I actually have 2 more translations over there, but I'm not going to use them. I went kind of crazy last year and bought a whole bunch of them. So of course we're using this particular translation that you guys have, the Feng English translation. But we're going to be using a whole lot of others, or at least I will, make reference to them first, on occasion. And also in terms of resources in your Canvas, there is a document in there, a PDF of translations of different Tao Te Chings. I got it from Mr. Smith, actually, but he got it from Boston University. The professor there compiled 8 different translations into one copy. So when you look at poems, and if you want a different take on it than the primary translation we're using, then certainly feel free to reference that document. I think it really comes in handy from time to time. Other than the Bible, the Tao Te Ching is the most translated book in the world. And being that it's so old, and being that it is from an entirely different time period and context, so being that that the Tao Te Ching has been translated for so many times from a different language, that is an ancient language, and outside of its historical context, the Tao Te Ching is translated many different ways, but all of them, in a way, are true to the original. There's just, and this is like an issue of language. I won't get philosophical about language here for a second, but of course the meaning of words is incredibly significant. And when you're talking about poetry, as I'm sure you've looked, the Tao Te Ching is poetry. Word and word choice becomes even more significant. I think one of the most important questions that philosophy should concern itself with is, what is it to live a good life, right? How does one live a good life? And that's what the Tao Te Ching is. I mean, sure, there's lots of things like ethics and ontology and virtue and things like that tied up in this book, but all of it points towards a particular way to live. And Lao Tzu, the author, believed that this particular way, and certainly Taoists, many Taoists have come after him, that this is the way that can lead someone to a life of happiness, in harmony with yourself, with the universe, and with nature. So the Tao Te Ching is a book of, in a way it's hard to call it philosophy. I would call it maybe a book of wisdom. Certainly it's philosophy. It's not philosophy like we understand it in the Western tradition. But that's why I think Eastern philosophy is so very interesting, and why I wanted to introduce this book to you. And I will say at the outset, I am not an expert in Eastern philosophy, certainly not in the way that I am with the Western philosophy. But I hope that the exposure to Eastern philosophy outweighs my inadequacies with Eastern philosophy, and so for whatever misleading or stereotypical ways that I might unintentionally represent the ideas in this book, I hope it is worth the time and effort that goes into it. for you to have some exposure to Eastern philosophy. Now, there is a religion of Taoism. Taoism, as a religion, did start hundreds of years after the Tao Te Ching was written. And so the Tao Te Ching cannot be compared to, say, like the Bible. The Tao Te Ching is an important book, and its significance to Taoists is great, but there are a number of religious texts that Taoists use. And you'll find as we go through this particular book, though there is some concept of sort of a world or a universal spirit, it's certainly not formalized like you would say a religious text generally is. All right, so so we're going to approach this from a philosophical standpoint, not a religious one. Although some philosophical topics, especially metaphysical topics, do certainly concern themselves with, I guess, what we might call a spiritual nature of existence. Yes, so the Tao Te Ching was credited to Lao Tzu. There's a couple of different ways you can spell that. You will either see his name spelled Lao-Tzu or Laozis. There's two different ways that that Western languages translate non-Latin languages, Latin alphabet languages. I hope I'm saying that right. So anyway, there's different spellings, and if you're wondering why a book that is, the title is Tao Te Ching, but it's spelled Taoteching, it is pronounced Tao as in D-O-W, Day, D-E, and Jing, J-I-N-G. Again, you will sometimes see it spelled with a D, and most times when you look at Taoism, as far as like a religion goes, you know, perhaps in your world history course from last year, it's probably spelled with a D. So again, it just depends on, it's kind of a translation thing. Very similar to, you know, you have the Russian czars. That's either spelled C-Z-A-R or T-S-A-R, but it's both pronounced the same, czar. Which you would think would start with a Z, but that's not how it translates into our particular alphabet. Anyway, I digress. The book is 81 poems. Now the poems are not arranged in any particular order. You will certainly see that there are themes throughout the poems, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But it's just 81 straight poems. These poems do not have titles. Some translations do title the poems, and one of the exercises we will do actually through, make sure I use the correct verbiage, through your learning activities, is for you to create titles for some of the poems. But traditionally the poems do not have titles. And in fact, the compiling of the poems, it's questionable as to whether or not they were 81 separate poems, or that someone who came along later and took these poems and compiled them together into the way that they are arranged. It could have been 100 poems, it could have been, anyway. But it's 81 poems. So the themes that we'll find in these 81 poems all have to do with the idea of, again, how to live a good life in harmony with yourself, the universe, and with nature. So some of the themes we'll see are the idea of non-action, which is Wu Wei, and we'll talk about that when we get to the poems that address it. But it's the idea of being in the zone and letting go of control. The idea of simplicity, idea of virtue, humility, the ego, and like the harm that the ego does to us as humans. The idea of balance, the idea of unity. And these ideals are represented through different images throughout the book. So you'll often hear the poems referring to the sage or the wise one, which is just sort of a wise person. You'll hear the term uncarved block, like a block of wood. Again, we'll talk about each of these as we get to them. Water is a big symbol in the book itself. Woman or mother is a big symbol. The infant, soldiers, rulers. So these virtues, if you will, these themes, will be played out through the poems by using these images of the sage, the wise, the uncarved block, the woman, the infant, etc. So Lao Tzu was a contemporary of Confucius, which of course is responsible for one of the other great forks, if you will, threads, streams of philosophy in China, Confucianism. And they both lived at the same time and apparently in the same region. Now, of course, this is 2,500 years ago, so how accurate is this? But there is actually an account where Confucius met Lao Tzu. So, you know, did they meet? It's pretty likely, which is really kind of fun to think about, Lao Tzu and Confucius, because they're kind of both two sides of that yin-yang symbol. You know, Confucianism is usually more associated with the light side of it, and Taoism, because of its nature and attention on balance and harmony and being supple and going with the flow, is usually associated with the dark side. So to think of these two great philosophers coming together and having a conversation is pretty exciting. Anyway, so did they meet? Likely. The Red Pine translation states that a sufficient number of ancient texts report that this meeting happened, making it rather unlikely that it was invented by Taoists. And famously, Confucius was very impressed with his interaction with Lao Tzu. And the quote is, "Today when I met Lao Tzu, it was like meeting a dragon." Like it was that powerful and intense of an experience. So why Lao Tzu wrote the book? Actually, he didn't write the book. He didn't write the book, just like many of the great thinkers that come from the Axial Age, which was this sort of 1,000-year time period where some of our great religions and great world philosophies developed. He didn't write anything down, just like Socrates didn't write anything down, just like Jesus Christ didn't write anything down. Just like Buddha did not write anything down. Their followers are the ones who wrote things down. So as the story goes, and go think back to your world history course in ancient China with the idea of the bureaucratic government and dynasties. Lao Tzu was a government administrator. Like he worked in the bureaucracy of the government. He was, let's see here, the keeper of royal archives. Sounds like a very important job. He was the keeper of royal archives. Now, to make a long story short, a new leader comes to town in the government. A new leader appears, and suddenly Lao Tzu finds that his position in the government has become a little precarious. So he's like, done with this. And so he leaves the government, and really he leaves urban life altogether, and heads out towards the mountains into nature, and to really kind of live out his life as a hermit. So this is how the story goes. He stopped at the Hankou Pass on his way out of town by a guard, and of course he was well known for his wisdom. And one of the guards supposedly would not allow him to pass through the gates into the Hankou Pass without his wisdom being written down. So supposedly the Tao Te Ching was compiled when Lao Tzu told this soldier, this guard, all of his information, or all of his wisdom rather, and thus the Tao Te Ching was born. There are competing theories on exactly how it came about. We truly don't know how it came about. Just like many of the great ancient texts of holy figures and philosophers, we're not exactly sure how some of those came about. Like check out the pre-Socratics, ancient Greece philosophers. A lot of curiosity there to how those were even compiled and put together, some of their thoughts. Okay, what else to say about the Tao Te Ching? Let's talk about the title itself. So Tao, T-A-O, Tao, some translations refuse to translate it. They just leave it as Tao. And in fact, when you read the poems, it will reference it as Tao. But some translators typically will translate Tao as in way or path. Way or path. Te, or day, sorry, day, so T-E, Tao Te Ching, day means virtue. So we're talking about the ethical side of things, right? Virtue. And Jing just simply means book. So Tao Te Ching simply means the way or path, the book of the way of virtue, the book of the way of virtue, or the book to the path of virtue. So that's what Tao Te Ching means, if you're wondering what that was. Now, I read the introduction a couple weeks ago, and I was thinking, like, I don't know that reading the introduction does you a lot of good at this point. It might make a whole lot more sense what it's talking about after you've experienced some of the book. However, if you did want to read part of the introduction, I suggest pages XV, so that's 15 in Roman numerals, but XV through XXI, which is page 21 in Roman numerals. That will give you the basics of, like, the Tao Te Ching ideas that surround it. So you can invest your time in that if you want to. And the last thing I'll say about Tao Te Ching, and then I'll let you go, is that some people get a little frustrated with it because it's very abstract and vague. So let's talk Eastern versus Western philosophy. There's of course a stereotype attached with Eastern philosophy, and wise sayings in general. Last week we were watching Mulan, because why not? We were watching Mulan, and if you're familiar with the movie, there at the end, she ends up with the emperor, and he says this line. The emperor says, "No matter how the wind howls, the mountain cannot bow to it." And you're like, yes. Some people say, the Tao Te Ching is frustrating because it's just a bunch of sayings that sound wise, but really there's not a lot to them. So the Tao Te Ching and a lot of Eastern philosophy does not spell out its claims and justifications in the same way that Western philosophy does. The Tao Te Ching is a work of philosophy that you're going to have to bring yourself to. It's not lazy man philosophy. In the Western tradition, of course, you have philosophers who write in a very, well, not all of them, but in a very sort of formulaic way, where they have claims and they have justifications for those claims. They talk about counterclaims, and they basically spell out the entire argument for you. That's not Eastern philosophy. At least that's not the Tao Te Ching. And you'll see as we move through the book, you will be really put in the place of doing quite a lot of the work. It will say some things that are very thought-provoking. But what you do with those phrases that are thought-provoking is up to you. So the meaning of the book and the substantial nature, I suppose, of the conclusions you might reach will be a lot due to your own reflection on it. And of course the reflection of others, which is what our very exciting video conference is going to include. Okay, honestly, it's been 20 minutes, and that's probably long enough. I'm really sad that none of my animals have made their way into our video today. Hold right there. Let me go see if I can find... I have 5, so I may as well feature one in every video, right? Hang on. Hold that right back. Hey, guys. Here's Alfred. Hey. Thank you, Alfred. Thank you. Alfred is very wise. Like Lao Tzu. Say hello to everyone. Hi, guys. Well, I hope that was exciting for you. Alright. Well, guys, I'm going to make another video that you can watch where I go over Poem 1 in depth. And really, I think once we start just getting into the book, you'll get what it's all about. So, thanks for tuning in, and I hope I did an adequate Good enough job. He's like rubbing his face on my leg. See you later. Bye, guys. From an entirely different time period and context, and being that, there goes the train of thought, being that, no matter how the wind howls, the mountain cannot move it. Is that what it says? That's not what it says. Let me repeat. So, being that... I hate this. Well, clearly I edited that. Alright, I have all these notes here and I'm not staying on track whatsoever. Here we go. So, the emperor says, no matter how the wind howls, the mountain cannot bow. That's what it is, bow. I will edit that. Here we go. The emperor, I'm back. So clearly I edited that.